Good night, all. Just give me a few minutes. I'm just trying to get the guest speaker to find out if he's having problems getting on. So just give me a few minutes and we'll be able to start. Thank you.
When disasters strike beyond the capacity of the 14 regional corporations, or TEMA, the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Management immediately shifts from monitoring and supporting through the activation of the National Emergency Operations Center as Trinidad and Tobago's Strategic Disaster Coordinating Agency. The ODPM steps in to coordinate our national resources. Together, we utilize an all-of-society approach to save lives and bring relief to our citizens, visitors, and our Caribbean neighbors to build a more resilient Trinidad and Tobago. The ODPM coordinates resources during national disasters.
From its lofty perch in a nutmeg tree, the Pawi sees another sunrise. She doesn't know if she'll see another. The Pawi is one of the world's most endangered bird species. Few people have ever seen it in its natural habitat in the rainforest of northeastern Trinidad. The Pawi is a large black turkey-like bird. Many of its wing feathers are white-tipped, often forming a checkered-like pattern on the wing. Slender black feathers, edged with white, make up its crown. The bird has a light blue face, black beak, brilliant blue wattle extending from its throat, and red feet.
The Paui are usually seen in small groups or individually, and usually when feeding. Their diet consists of fruits, seeds, leaves, and flowers of forest species, as well as some domestic crop species that may have been introduced into their habitat.
Paui is important to the national park and Grand River on a whole because one, it's one of the island's endemic birds. It's on the endangered species list, and Grand River is one of the easiest viewing points on the island for that bird.
The Paui is famous for being the largest fruit-eating bird in Trinidad and Tobago. This allows for the Paui to disperse much larger seeds than other birds.
Seed dispersal by Paui has been decreasing because the population itself has been decreasing. This may cause threats to the health of our local forests. The researchers have found that the Paui population has decreased significantly from thousands of birds to less than 200 worldwide.
The Paui is also a main attraction for ecotourism in the Matura National Park. The bird's naturally curious and social nature has become the root of its misfortune, as it is easily preyed upon by hunters. They also have a tendency to avoid long flights and therefore hard.
Hi guys.
Hi, good evening, everyone. The guest speaker is logging on, so just
Hi,
give us a
guys.
minute. You on?
I think so. Am I on?
Oh, yeah, good evening, Doctor.
That's what
Welcome, welcome.
I'm going to send the email to those.
I appreciate. Good evening, everyone.
Hi, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
All right, let me take the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker this evening. And I want to welcome all the Interact members and the Rotaract members to our training session this evening. You'll enjoy what Dr. Ramroop has to give. So let me briefly introduce Dr. Ramroop, and I'll let him take over the show this evening. So, past District Governor Stephen Ramroop is a specialist orthopedic and trauma surgeon. His early education started from Jordan Hill Primary, and then he went to Presentation College, where he received the Winshaw Gold Medal for A-level scholastic achievement. I remember that medal used to be given year after year, and poor Napima College couldn't get it, sorry. UA, he graduated with his MBBS from 1980 to 85 in medicine, and then he went on to the Royal College of Physician and Surgeon in Edinburgh and Glasgow, Scotland, where he specialized. He also did a degree in MBA at the University of Phoenix and another degree at a Master of Science in Forensic Medicine at the University of Florida. He had the Emergency Medicine and Trauma Department from 2000 to 2009, leading a team of 25 doctors. Then he was promoted to Medical Chief of Staff, leading a team of 50 specialists, doctors, 52 registered, 200 house doctors, plus medical staff, nurses, technicians, among others. Then he moved across to the OPDM, where he was the CEO and where he managed a staff of 27 people in comprehensive disaster management. He's also a lecturer at the University of Trinidad and Tobago. He also conducts certificate in disaster management. He was the past district governor of the District 7030, and he has many Rotary awards, I should say, for his service to Rotary for over the past many years, including the recent one from San Fernando South, Rotary Club of San Fernando South. He has donated several wheelchairs to deserving citizens, and he continued to do so. And he presently head the disaster committee for the zone 7030 in Rotary. He's married, and I should mention he's a good chef. So Dr. Ramroop, is over to you.
Thank you very much, Darren Ryan. Rotarians. Okay, so Darren, how much time I have? Because I know you told me the meeting. How long do I have?
You have 45 minutes to an hour, doctor.
Okay. Right. Okay, good. So what I'm hoping to do is, can everyone hear me? If anyone, I guess everyone can hear me. There's a little button underneath where you can put a little hand up, if you have any time. What I'm hoping to do is to make it a bit interactive, because I have a number of slides, but I thought that for Rotary and for Rotarians, we don't really want to do that. We wanted to make it more interactive and try to get some questions. And when we get questions, it will be easier for us to interact. And I think that is how we should do it. So what I will do is I will make it more pertinent to what Rotary clubs should be doing. And I'll let you understand the whole framework by which I think that the District 7030 disaster team, how it is that we would like you to work in the context of Rotary International in terms of the strategic plan and in terms of the 7th area of focus, which I think most of you all know, we now have a 7th area of focus, which is really the environment. So within the context of the environment, which is the 7th area of focus, we are hoping Rotarians will now focus on the communities and look at ways in which we can protect our environment and maintain some degree of coexistence and resiliency within our communities, and thus make our communities better able to deal with any hazards that will come our way. So, Deonora, if people have any questions, what they can do is they can put up their hands or write on the chat, and whoever is the other host, they could look at the chats. And then when I ask if there's any questions, maybe they could ask the questions. And what I will do, I will turn on my chat so I can see if anybody has any questions as we go on. You could just type the questions, and when I get time, I will answer them. So in order not to bore you all, because 45 minutes is a pretty long time, and most of you all know pretty much about disasters in the sense that you have been working in communities with a lot of flooding. Now, one of the CEOs of ODPM after me got literally fired, or he had to resign, because he came on the news and said that the flooding that we had at the time, which I think was around Diwali time, wasn't really a disaster. And I think one of the things what I would like to do with most of the Rotary clubs, hopefully within this year, under Sonia, who is our DG, and as part of the mitigation planning program and preparedness, because there are two Rotarian past governors who are chairing disasters in our District 7030. David Edwards deals with more of the response when an event occurs, whereas myself, I am doing mostly the training and trying to develop with the clubs community toolkits that will enable clubs such as your club and clubs within communities where there are multiple hazards, that you all can actually go within the communities with your partners in service, such as Rotaract, Interact, and maybe Community Cause. And you all can get in there with the other key stakeholders, such as Red Cross, such as Habitat for Humanity, which I know that the Rotaracts are involving themselves with. Seventh-day Adventist has a very good disaster preparedness program. And of course, there's another church, I think the Jesus Christ and Latter-day Saints. The Catholic Church also has a disaster preparedness committee. Now, the strategic plan of Rotary says very clearly that we have to work more strategically, and we have to work more sensibly, and we have to work smarter rather than harder. Rotarians have to know that, and we have to do projects within the community that creates a legacy. In other words, and when we go 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the line, we say, hey, Mr. Rotarian in the Rotary Club did this, Dr. Mr. in Rotary did this, Mr. Monroe did this, and Miss Mongol did this, and whatever it is. So the thing about it is that we must be able to say that we impacted the community in which we serve. And therefore, our projects have to have high impact. That is one of the requirements of Rotary Strategic Plan. We must create projects that are institutionalized. In other words, then we must make something that becomes a system and a process rather than a one-off. And I think this is what I'm going to say now in the next 10 to 15 minutes, and therefore I'll entertain questions after. Let me put it in context and let me make sure we understand what I'm saying. It is very good. It is excellent that when a community floods, and I'm going to use some instances that you all are very, very accustomed with, flooding. Flooding per se is a hazard. We try not to use the word disaster in the science and the disaster communities. In the scientific community, we try not to use the word disaster. And I think that is where that CEO got into trouble, because he was actually taking science and the fraternity of disaster risk reduction people and not explaining it carefully to the citizens of the country and the lay people. In other words, then, if we knew, we know that it's not a disaster when somebody or some nation or some community can deal with something. So let me put that into context. Let us say that you have a street with flooding. One of the houses is a 2-story house, and they are able to go upstairs and have enough wherewithal and assistance within their home to get the stuff on their bottom floor, which is normally flooded, and they take it upstairs and they protect it. They have everything wrapped. They have the plugs above the water line, the electrical plugs, because they got an electrician to change that house. And instead of having plugs on the ground, which is what the TN Tech people require before they give an approval for a completion certificate, then this is something that the Rotary Club can sit down with TN Tech and the engineers and explain to them that in flooding communities, we need to have a different type of engineering and a different type of protocols and certification criteria, because you cannot have plugs at the level of which that flood will come, especially for people who live near to rivers. So these are the kind of things that Rotary has to get involved in, because we keep going back to these houses and we keep seeing that the electrical systems are in a mess after, because all the plugs get corroded with mud and all of these things. So the person who is in a flooded area, and that happens a lot, for example, in St. Helena, and a lot of the people who live close to rivers, a lot of these people have become resilient. A flood comes, they move everything out, it washes down their house, it nasties it up, they get up in a hose after they wash it down, and they're good to go after. Now, this is resilience, and they have not experienced a disaster. It is different to another person who might be living down the road, who has a flat house, who built a flat house next to a river, 100 feet away from a river. He built a flat house, and he has his plugs below, he has his mattress downstairs, he has his television on the ground, and he doesn't have it above where you can look up with a bolt and an anchor on top, but he has it on the ground. And he has his bed and everything in such a way that if the water comes and above the water line, in the last 5 years, flood came, it went up to a certain level, and then he rebuilt. Then Rotary Club gave him donations, they washed it down. The government gave him a new bed, the government gave your taxpayers money, your new stove, and then the flood comes and it gets messed up again. So that is what we are hoping that Rotarians and Rotaractors and interactors can try to, what we call, mitigate. In other words, then you do an assessment of that street, because it's a disaster for the guy who has nobody to help him. It's a disaster, for example, for one person in that village who got a stroke a few days ago, and then he is disabled and a flood comes. And this is much different to about 4 weeks ago when he didn't have a stroke and the same flood came. He was able to wash down everything, but 4 weeks after he got a stroke. So right away, he becomes a liability in that street. He is the one might die because he's lying down there with a stroke. He might be alone. He might have an elderly person with him. So what I'm trying to say is that there are so many permutations and combinations that exist in that street. In developed societies, we have community-based organizations that have an understanding of the people who live in that street. Now, what is pretty interesting is that politics allows us to do that. Certain parties, and in fact, the two main parties in Trinidad and Tobago, during elections, they have street captains or whatever that actually walk this whole street, and they can tell you who's going to vote this UNC and who's going to vote PNM and DLP, and this has been going on for years. So the system by which somebody can map a particular street and say who is at risk using a very simple formula that we all did in elementary school in terms of what we call arithmetic, where they have two sides of an equation. Risk is equal to hazards. And that is, hazards are, for example, natural hazards are earthquake, hurricanes. They are natural hazards. Flooding is a mixture of natural and man-made. So a lot of the South American countries call it a socio-natural disaster. Because as you know, flooding comes from rivers. In other words, and if you live next to a river, many of you all here I'm seeing on the chat would have done geography at O level or CSEC level. And you would have understood that a river has three courses: an upper course, middle course, and a lower course. And whether you like it or not, in the Nile and the Ganges and the Amazon and all of these, it's the same thing, right? In the lower course, all this mud and silt comes and you build up your deltas, and that is how you have beautiful little islands and things in the delta. It's what rivers do. So therefore, if you live next to a river, the river is not going to stop doing what it's supposed to do because you just came and built a flat there. In other words, and it continues to do its work. And therefore, there are societies in the East, for example, where people live in rivers. I don't know if any of you all had the opportunity to visit some of these. There are certain restaurants, for example, you can rent a room in a little, on the river itself. And in the morning, there's these little boats that will pass around with food and whatever, and you can even buy food and you sit in your little hammock with your little kitchen, and it's beautiful. But when the monsoons come, there's a siren, for example, if the river water is rising because of an early warning system. And once that river starts to rise because of excessive rain, everybody packs their jaji bundle. I don't know if any of the young people know what that means, but everybody packs a little bag, even the little children. And they pack these little bags, and there's this big barge that passes up, a little boat that passes. Everybody jumps on the boat. They protect their stuff. They go on the mainland to temporary shelters. When the rain comes, it washes everything. And then after that, a big boat comes and washes down all the little areas, and they go back to what they're doing. And that is resiliency. In other words, they live in the rivers, but they accommodate and they adapt to what they have. And this is what you Rotarians have to understand, that we need in Trinidad. Flooding will come. The science of flooding and the philosophy of the science of flooding says that we have to live with the water. If any of you all have been to Amsterdam, or you have been to New Orleans, and you have been to a lot of these areas where people live in the sea, they live in water, right? You go to gondolas, for example, in Europe, and you travel in water, and you go to restaurants right on the water. As a matter of fact, just recently, they're having a problem in some of these countries because of the infrastructure, where there's flooding. Even while you're dining in Holland, for example, Amsterdam recently, there was flooding. So the people are living with the water. They've been living for hundreds of years. See? So what we have to do is, why the South Americans call it socio-natural, is because water will come anyhow you look at it. That's the natural part. But the social part is when you put garbage, and when the fellow up the road is building his house and he drops a load of sand or gravel in the thing, when people throw away their garbage and it lands up and it blocks up the drains. When you go up to Port of Spain, for example, and the afternoon showers, which is typically there in the rainy season months, and the rain comes and the water comes down the lower part, for example, in the lower part of the city, for example, Southgate, you see a lot of garbage, a lot of paper cups, Kentucky boxes and plastic bags, and they block the system. They block the small drains, and therefore water goes onto the street. So in other words, then there is a social part of it, right? And if you build a house near the river, and you don't put in proper electricity and protect your valuables, put stuff higher up than the water line, the last water line that the floods came in. In other words, if you don't put mitigation programs in, it will be a disaster. So the definition of a disaster depends on the circumstance and who it affects. So what the house that has a disabled person, nobody to help them move the stuff, a flood will cause a disaster. So a street might not be a disaster for the entire street, but an actual house. In a municipality, for example, like the Penal David municipality, a particular street may not have a disaster where another street might have a disaster. Then you might have Penal David might have a disaster where the ability to cope with a particular hazard becomes overwhelmed. But then there's a disaster for Penal David and not a disaster for San Fernando and not a disaster for Princestown. So by getting the resources from the other municipalities, then it doesn't become a disaster, so that other persons can cope with the hazard and move people out of the situation. Okay? So basically, what you're saying then is risk is equal to hazard. The type of hazard, the frequency of the hazard, the severity of the hazard, okay? And the ability to cope with the hazard. So that is definitely hazard. And if you multiply that by vulnerability, the vulnerability is like, for example, if the fit man, right, 4 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, was able to clean out his house and wash out his home, then he didn't have a vulnerability then. So it wasn't a disaster for him. It wasn't a risk for him. But then 4 weeks after, he got a stroke and he couldn't move and he was confined to bed and the water came up and nearly killed him. Then he is vulnerable because he becomes a person just 4 weeks after with a stroke and he becomes vulnerable. And vulnerability is actually proportional to risk. So risk is equal to hazard multiplied by vulnerability. Now, when you draw a line over that and you put capacity underneath, this is where Rotary comes in. Many people understand arithmetic from long before, and our teachers used to teach us fractions. We said 1 over 2 and 4 over 6 and 5 over 10. The bigger the denominator is, the smaller the fraction. We all learned that, didn't we? So if, for example, you have on top the numerator, you have risk is equal to hazard multiplied by vulnerability, and you put a line under that, then the denominator is capacity. So if you increase the capacity like a fraction, you decrease the left-hand side of the equation, which is risk. So by increasing capacity, you decrease risk. If you increase the hazards, you increase risk. If you increase the vulnerability, you increase risk. And if you increase the denominator, which is capacity, you decrease risk. Now, this is something that if you take away anything from today, right? If you write down that as the Rotarians, you would have learned basically what you need to learn as Rotarians. You need to learn what risk is. The current science and the current requirement or strategy for the world in terms of disaster is a focus of agencies like ours, Rotary, institutions like ours, Rotary, focus on risk reduction. In other words, then, we don't talk about disaster preparedness. I mean, we have that, it's just because I couldn't change it. And people still understand disaster and what it is, but understand there is no disaster if you can cope with it. Yes, so that is one. Secondly, what you might call a disaster in one situation may not be a disaster for the whole. That's a summary of what I just said. And thirdly, risk is what you need to focus on, and we need to reduce risk. Now, how can Rotary clubs understand the reduction of risk, and how can you reduce the risk that we just talked about? Well, you reduce the ability of the hazards to affect you. Certain hazards you can't prevent, like earthquakes and hurricanes. You could prevent hurricanes in a way by decreasing the greenhouse gases and making sure your country try to reduce the carbon monoxide outflows and all of those on a longer stage. And that's climate change and climate adaptation. And man is doing a lot to damage its climate. So those are longer term deliverables that we as Rotary clubs would have to do in terms of the 7th area of focus of the Rotary Foundation, which is the environment. So in other words, then we encourage Interact clubs and Rotaract clubs to lobby for proper climate change adaptation. There's a lot of things that affect hurricanes, and it also affects how we are impacted by these hazards. So, for example, if you go to the south coast and the east coast of Trinidad, you can see within the space of a year or 2 years, there's so much coastal erosion that is occurring. Now, these are things that are going on that Rotary clubs must lobby with some of the agencies to government to try to see if we can do things to preserve our coastline, because we are losing a lot of the coastline. Seawater is rising, and that is because of the melting of the glaciers. Now, these things, you might think it doesn't affect us, but it affects us because go down to Cedros and Icacus. Many of us drew a nice little tip of Icacus when we were in geography and when we were in school, but that tip doesn't exist again. A lot of that has eroded out, and that is happening before our very eyes. So hazards, you can't reduce and diminish some of the hazards because they are naturally occurring. Some of the man-made man-made hazards that we can reduce are things like littering, things like proper drainage. This is what the government and the municipalities have a responsibility for in terms of building proper bridges, widening some of the waterways, preserving some of the catchment areas, for example, like the Mosquito Creek waste, the waterland, the wasteland, the swamp and the marshes there, right? It is very important for those watersheds to be preserved, and therefore, when you build a road in the watershed, it affects that flow, and it will cause more problems in terms of flooding, in terms of communities way behind, such as Woodland and all of those areas behind that Mosquito Creek there. So in other words, then one thing leads to another. Now, we can't stop the highway now, but these are things that we have to look, maybe the future engineers of the Rotaract Club and the Interact Club will probably have to build something called a causeway there. In other words, then it's a big highway that goes way above that whole entire thing, thus preserving the ecological state of that beautiful watershed, which we call the Mosquito Creek and all of those areas inside there. So these are things that maybe we may not be able to deal with them because of politics right now and governance. But basically, these are things that the Rotaractors and Interactors, as they progress in terms of their lives and in terms of their education, these are things that in Trinidad and Tobago, such a small, beautiful country, we need you to change and focus on. And we can do this with engineering. Anybody who has driven from New York to New Jersey can understand that there's a big causeway that goes right over that swampy land, right over there. And people were talking about building a highway through the watersheds in the Woodland and areas going up the point. So these are things that Rotary clubs can get involved in the discussion and the education in terms of our community stakeholders. For example, there's a guy called Edward Moody, who is actually in the South area. We don't know if it's politics or whatever it is, but basically there are certain existing institutional agencies or organizations or groups that actually work within the communities to deal with flooding and the causes of flooding. So what I'm saying now is that Rotary clubs and Interact clubs and Rotaract clubs can actually look at some of these people, bring them on the table with government agencies such as the municipalities and the Ministry of Works and Transport in terms of bridges and major roads, bring them together with Habitat for Humanity, with the local government corporation, etc., and bring these people together and start looking at developing and enhancing the existing early warning systems. Early warning systems are what are used all over the world to seismic users, for example, to tell you that an earthquake is about to happen. Now, some earthquakes happen in seconds, so it doesn't work that well as maybe for flooding. There are many persons who live along the rivers, for example, in Woodland, who can tell you when a flood is actually going to happen because they live there. They look at the clouds and they see the rain. They have been there so many years, and they can tell you when that water reaches that part of that tree root there by that river, we're going to get flood. So this is where community-based and indigenous and cultural factors and actually they assist people in terms of helping communities, and we must use them. Many people who live in communities develop their own indigenous warning signs, and the science of disaster risk reduction is asking institutions and organizations like Rotary to work with these community people, find out some of the things that they know about their own hazards, and develop them in such a way that they can warn the other persons. For example, when we went to Cuba, Cuba deals with emergencies and hazards much better than most of the Caribbean islands. And when we were sent to Cuba when I was in ODPM, they had a system where they had a community-based early warning points. Now, when I was in ODPM, what we did is we had an UNDP funding, and we got that system to be implemented in Mayaro, the Rio Claro Mayaro Regional Corporation. And it is working pretty well. And if you look at how the corporations deal with their disasters or their hazards and their hazard impacts, you'll realize that Rio Claro Mayaro has a better system because we implemented that early warning points there. Basically what it is, guys, is like people who are living within the area, for example, retired teachers, retired police officers, retired sports captains, or whatever it is, key stakeholders within the communities. We bought radios for them. You can get some Chinese radios that are very cheap. These little radios that could communicate, walkie-talkies, between 5 houses and 10 houses, and each one has this radio. And what we do is we give them the training. You go to the village councils or the little church or the little sports area and whatever, and Rotary Club comes with the Rotaract Club, Interact Clubs, other communities, and we teach them how to communicate with each other. Because what happens is that sometimes when a flood occurs, the people who are most vulnerable get the least help because they're so away from everybody else. What we find is the stronger people, the more lusty people who have big voice mouth and big mouth, they will get help before. And that happens a lot when we give humanitarian aid post-disaster. Post-disaster, there's a lot of politics involved, 1. 2, there's a lot of hampers and pampers because people like the fact that they can take a photograph giving somebody something. Many photographs have been taken of persons who are actually going into flooding communities, actually going with water and having people in the water and giving them water and food and hampers and pampers. When you take that picture and you send it to some of the people abroad and people look at it, they look at us as primitive. They look at us as backward. Because the teaching is, if you are in a certain amount of water, you must remove the people from the water. You don't go and give them humanitarian aid in the water. That's not good at all. So these are things that we do as Rotarians. We do that as well. And we do the wrong thing, you see? And part of that is cultural. Part of that is due to security. Why security? Because part of the problem is that people are not willing to leave their homes in a flood and go to a shelter or go to what we call shelter in place. When we're doing a risk mapping, for example, let's say Rotaract and Interact and Red Cross and Habitat for Humanity and Rotarians on a Sunday morning, we go down to a particular area. We all go by somebody who can make a cook for us for lunchtime. We start from about 9 o'clock and we go down some particular streets that has had flooding, that have had flooding in the past 5 years. So we take those streets first because they are high risk, right? They will get flooding again, trust me. If there is one shorting, they will get flooding again. So you will have to go down and give them hampers and pampers again if you are alive in the next 10 years. So go to those streets first and start from a particular point and take a little sheet of paper and map, that is, go to each house and map how many people there. You can get help with the Trinidad and Tobago housing census. You can actually email the Ministry of Planning and Development, CSO, I think they have a different name now, Central Statistical Office, and you can actually let them send you a copy of the housing census. And what that does, it tells you how many dwellings in that village, how many males, how many females, how many businesses. It's a very good document. And if the Rotary Club can get that and they have it by corporations, they have it by Penal David Corporation, Siparia Corporation, whatever it is. So it's very easy to get for your area. And you print that out and you give it. And on a Sunday morning, maybe once a month, you go down and you map each street and you find out, just like the street captains did for the elections, you can find out each house, which one is at risk, which one has a vulnerable person, which one has old persons who would need the help. So when you go to give your hampers and pampers, you don't sit down and start from the beginning of the village and go down. You start from the most high-risk person where you know there are 2 stroke victims or there are 2 old persons or there's a single mother with 3 children. You know, these are the things I'm talking about. So it is better that you deal with that in that manner than just going out with a lot of fanfare and photographs and whatever and giving hampers and pampers, and you're starting in a particular area and you're walking down the street. You have to do it in a better way, in a more strategic manner. All right. So that is in terms of the more high impact programs, helping the communities in a better way in terms of developing mitigation against some of the hazards that they are frequently exposed to, right? So how much time I have gone there now?
You're doing pretty good, Doc. You went about a little over half an hour.
All right, great. So right. So somebody asks, how can we improve the systems that are existing and failing with regard to failing rain gauges? Now, early warning systems. I remember going to Japan, right? And in Japan, they have a very high degree of resiliency. What we are trying to say about the word resiliency is that it's like a bamboo, it's a green bamboo. And when you bend the bamboo, it doesn't break. That's what resiliency really means. It means that I will take the hazard, I will take the stress, but what will happen is that I will not break. And resiliency is that you can live in a situation where you are at risk, but you can mitigate and adapt to that hazard. This is what Rotarians have to do. But one of the fundamental tools that a community has to have to deal with a hazard impact and to prepare for that impact and to be able to survive that impact is something called an early warning system. One of the most highly evolved early warning systems is our own human body. Many of us knows about that. We hear it in our religions, we hear it all over the time. We have these senses, right? We have touch, we have taste, we have our vision, we have smell, we have hearing, right? And we have this last one called intuition. Over many years, if you go into a little area and you can just feel that this is a dangerous area, that's something that we have. We have it when we look at our children going to school. We have it like when we're going into a very bad area sometimes. So we have that sixth sense as well. So intuition is something that is built in communities. This is what I was talking about, the indigenous community. There were many societies, for example, in Japan, when they saw the tsunami, where the water was receding, they actually ran away and went to higher ground. Where some of the tourists who didn't understand it, oh my God, look, nice fish, let's go and pick the fish. And they were going into the water. So when the water came back, they died. So early warning systems is understanding some of the things that tell you. For example, we in Trinidad might understand some of the animals and their behavior, right? In some communities, the crickets start making noise long before the rains start to come, very bad rains. The animals and the birds, when you look at them, they fly away from a hazard. They don't go towards it. They have this sixth sense. So in certain communities, you have to find out what are those. In terms of the failing rain gauges, this is something that the Ministry of National Security, ODPM, that's one of their responsibility with the municipalities and the Water Resource Agency. There was a relationship between, at that time, TSTT and the Water Resources Agency and the ODPM to put these rain gauges in some of the big rivers that cause flooding, where water comes heavily, and you have riverine flooding from. They were also putting them in coastal areas where you had coastal surges and coastal flooding. When I left ODPM in 2017, we had a system called a National Operations Center. And the National Operations Center was getting feed from the TSTT and Water Resource Agencies in terms of these river gauges. And there was a soldier there who was assigned 24 hours to work with the ODPM alongside the Trinidad Defense Force and the police service. And we were looking at the highways, we were looking at the airport, we were looking at a number of things 24/7. So we had a better idea of things that were evolving as they happened. This has gone. due to whatever reason, politics or whatever it is, I don't know. But that whole National Operations Center system has gone, and the ODPM has been removed from that system. So therefore, what they did within this last government, what they're doing with this present government, sorry, is that they got science, which was a little wayward in terms of they are focusing more on in terms of building resiliency at the community level. In other words, then at the local government level. And that is good, that's fine. But we have a brain. So that if we had only early warning systems in our hand, in our feet, in our liver, in our kidney, and we didn't have a brain to coordinate everything else, we would have been lost as a species by now. We would have been dead. You see? So what I'm trying to tell you, you can build resiliency at the municipal level. But that causes problems. And that is why you, in most developed countries, you have one number, a 911 number. And that 911 number, right, when you call that number, if it is a police issue, it goes to the police center, but the 911 center patches that to the police center. If you call, for example, for a cat on a tree, it goes to the fire services, and the 911 center sends that. But if you call, for example, if you see water rising by your house, and it might come into your house, that's a disaster readiness number. And in my time, we had 511 for that. So we were hoping to have 911. You just call one number. You text it, you can WhatsApp it, whatever, and you send a message. And when you send it to that message, it goes onto a software, which has been monitored 24/7 by a soldier or somebody in a national operations center, so that when the rain gauge reaches a particular level, or the guy in Woodland, for example, like Cuba, he has a little phone that the Rotary Club gave him, and he calls a particular number and he says, oh my God, we might have flooding because I live here for 45 years and the water reaches that part of the root of the tree. I feel it's going to flood. I know it's going to flood. So he calls the 911 number and they patch him through the 511 number, which is a 24/7 operator. That operator puts it on a screen. And when he puts it on a screen, he sends it to fire, he sends it to police, and he sends it to the disaster unit of the Penal Davy Corporation. What is currently operating is that when you're in Penal Davy and you have a problem, you have to call a Penal Davy number. When you're in Siparia, you have to call a Siparia number. If you happen to go to Port of Spain and you're in Diego Martin, you have a problem, you call a Diego Martin number. So now you have 14 municipalities to call. So you have to go down a list somewhere and get one of 14 numbers. And when you're in Tobago, you have to call 211. This is madness. This is not science at all. This is jokiness. And this is the reason why when we had the flooding during the during the Diwali period, people nearly died. And this is the reason why people nearly died, for example, recently in a particular part of the country. The reason being, unlike the human body, where everything is central and coordinated so that the liver does its thing, but the brain knows what is going on. Right now, we have the 14 municipalities, like 14 livers and 14 kidneys all over the place, but it's not centrally coordinated. That is the reason why we are failing rain gauges, is because it is not feeding back into a central clearinghouse where somebody is monitoring 24/7, and then they now can dispatch the first responders. Legally, there are only 3 first responders in this country. 1, the police force, the police officers. 2, the fire officers. And 3, under standing orders, the ambulance service. Those are first 3 legal first responders. And don't get that mixed up at all. If you go in any scene and you feel that you're a cert person or you're a specialist doctor or you're this fancy person, they'll kick you out because you're not a legal first responder. When the first responder declares a scene safe, then other persons can come in, like Rotarians who are trained in disaster, community emergency response teams, etc. You see? So you have to be very clear about the law, right? So real-time monitoring is needed. Somebody put that, and I think that's what I was trying to say. What we set up was a 24/7 situational awareness system. When I went to FEMA in the United States, they took me to FEMA headquarters, and the FEMA head sits with the Homeland Security group of defense people, and he reports directly to the president. What it is therefore, they sit at the level of 24/7 surveillance. So when something happens in a country, right away, somebody in the middle of the night knows about it. You don't have to wait until it escalates, because when you go to one call center, let us say you're using the 911 or the 511 center instead of 14 different numbers. It means that I can tell when something is happening in Cedros or Icacos or Guayaguayari. When you are actually only calling one number, which is either the Rio Claro Mayaro or the Pinal David number, and you're only calling that number, then you do not have an overall understanding of how something is escalating. So real-time monitoring is very important. Anybody has any more questions? Right. So if you don't, what it is, I'd just like to finish off. How much minutes I have again, Mr. Jagannath?
You're going good. You're going pretty good. You have about 5 or 10 minutes.
Right, great.
To make it 45 minutes. You see, you're concerned about the 45 minutes and you make it 45.
Good. So therefore, what is the way forward in terms of Rotary, in terms of how Rotary can improve their services? We are not saying that hampers and pampers are not needed. Don't get me wrong. They are very important, because if you don't have water, what are the 4 main things that you have to have humanitarian aid and you have to consider very important? A human being could do without food for a little while, but he cannot do without water for more than at least 8 to 14 hours. So therefore, Rotarians themselves have to make sure that they have over 8 to 14 liters of water put away for themselves and their family. First aid is you can't go and help anybody if you can't help yourself first. Flying in a plane, you have to put oxygen on you first before you help the child next to you. So first aid has always been making sure you protect yourself first. Make sure your documents are secured. Make sure your house is prepared for flooding. Make sure you have your water, because water is the first thing that you need. After the water, the next thing is shelter. Some people even say shelter before water. Because, for example, when falling stones or asteroids are falling, or rain is falling, or hail is falling, or the hurricane is there and earthquake is there, you have to get a place that is actually sturdy enough to hold you. So therefore we say duck and run when there's an earthquake, duck and cover, right? And we also say now, if you have to evacuate a building, make sure and go to your muster points and all of these things. In a fire, you don't duck and cover, you have to get out. So there are certain things that you have to do for certain emergencies. Practice them. Do drills within the Rotary clubs, Rotaract clubs, and Interact clubs. Do a tabletop exercise. If you want to do a tabletop exercise, you can have me. I can actually teach you how to do it, and then you can do it after that, because I don't intend to be doing it for everyone. So what we can do is a Rotaract club, for example, you can arrange one of these, Rotarian Jagannath. We can arrange one of these with the Rotaract clubs if they're listening. And we can have, just like I do it here, I can conduct what is called a tabletop exercise. What is a tabletop exercise? Basically, it's like a simulation where we pretend that certain persons within the group are certain people. Let's say, like we can say, for example, Dr. Messer could be the CMOH, Mr. Jagannath, you could be the local government counselor. We have Amanda Mohan, she could be the medical doctor, right, in the RHA. Amari Mohammed could be the CEO of the local government corporation. See, so what we do, we put people to play certain roles. And when we do that, we give them these little snips of paper that says, okay, something has happened. There's an earthquake that has occurred. What will you do? Now, this is very good, because what it does, it identifies the gaps. This is something that we can do really. We can do it quickly. And when we do this, we'll be better prepared to develop a plan. In other words, then each Rotary club should have a disaster plan. Each Rotaract club should have a disaster plan or emergency plan. The components of that emergency plan must focus on the basic needs of a person. 1, water. 2, shelter. 3, food and nutrition. 4, security. And 5, access to health care. If you look at it, those are your 5 things that each Rotary club must make sure that is available to human beings or animals who are actually impacted by a hazard in the communities that they serve. You have to make sure you have water. You have to make sure you have proper shelter. And what is this proper shelter? That's what I told you. Go on a Sunday morning and do a mapping. Go to the street and find out who it is may need to have a shelter. If the neighbor next door with the 2-story house cannot take the person who might be flooded, then that person might have an aunt or uncle who lives in Gulf View or Bel Air or any of those areas that are not flooded. And therefore, what you can say is, if flooding occurs and I have to send the fire services and they come to you, would you want to go to your uncle or your aunt rather than going to a shelter in a school? And most of the people, especially those people with young girls, young children, they would say, you know what, I want to go to my aunt or uncle. Now, when the fire services come, they don't know that. So if the Rotaract Club, Interact Club in association with the Red Cross and the community center, whatever, knows that in a particular street, if I have to evacuate somebody, these people will go by their family, these people will go by the school, and these people will go by the neighbor. Now, these are things we should know beforehand. So that when the real flood comes, if there is a hurricane that turns south for some reason, and there's lots of flooding, then we will really have a problem. You see? So it will happen. It's going to happen. Climate change is allowing that to happen. You can see that with the rain, where the rain just falls heavily. It's like if somebody drops a bucket of water on you. That is different to 10 years ago, right? That is a different kind of rainfall. You can hear it on your roofs if you have galvanized roofs. It's different. And the water just doesn't get enough time to soak into the soil. So it runs into your houses and it runs into, that is the change. That is what we're seeing. So mapping of your streets and villages, tabletop exercises, your emergency operations plans. What are the constituents of an emergency operation plan? If somebody put it up, I'll give them $100. But what it is, we don't have time, but I tell you. One, you must have something called an egress or evacuation plan. If something happens in your house, do you have the keys that opens the burglar proof in your door? Some children died in Marabella because those are the kind of things that you have to understand, right? If a fire occurs in your house, how do you go? Where do you go? And do you have the keys for that burglar proof that is in your main door, or do you have to go through a window? Now, these are things that you have to have. You have to have an evacuation plan or egress plan. The two are different. I can't tell you about it now. You have to have a contingency plan. What you do in terms of a fire in your house, an earthquake in your house, or flooding. These are simple hazards that you have to have. Thirdly, you have to have what is called a business continuity plan. If you have a store, a business, a doctor's office, you have a parlor, whatever it is, you have to have a business continuity plan. It's a very simple plan that you have to do. Or Rotaract clubs, Interact clubs can actually help other people in a village to have a business continuity plan. People have cement in the village. People have groceries, they have flour, they have pharmacies with medications and drugs. If they have business continuity plans and you have a disaster in that village, you don't have to go far for your insulin medication. You don't have to go far for your Panadol and your prednisolone and your antizan and your antihistamines and your mosquito repellents. You don't have to go far. If somebody has a generator and they can generate ice and have refrigeration, and they can provide the ice for your meat that is going to spoil within that same village. So these are the kind of things that you're going to have to do, you know? Good. No questions? So I have 51 persons on board and no questions.
Dr. Ramroop, one quick one for you. The Rotaract members and the Interact members had we were discussing about your certificate course. I don't know if you want to touch a minute or two on.
So we have a certificate course that we do at the University of Trinidad and Tobago. It's accredited, and they can do the course on Introduction to Disaster Risk Reduction, which is what I just said. It helps a lot of people. It helps you with your resumes. We have one on business continuity planning. We have one on crisis communication and management. In other words, Rotarians are people who are actually in the Rotary clubs. We recommend that there be 2 designates for disaster coordinators in each Rotary club, Rotaract club, and Interact club. When we have a national disaster or anything else, these are the persons who will form part of a discussion, and we can actually hook them up to the ODPM center. So they form a conduit to communication. So crisis communication and crisis management, very important, right? Those are 3 of the main courses. We also have a community emergency response training certificate course. This course is a very good course for persons within the communities that Rotary Club might identify. So you can have a fundraiser such as a barbecue or something and raise funds for a community, and then identify certain persons in that community who are there. You don't have to be there, who you can actually send up to train in that UTT program, and they'll get a certificate, as well as you can purchase some like a bag. So when you're giving out the certificates at the handing over at your ceremony, at your club or whatever it is, and you're giving the certificates, you could give them this little bag which will have the basic items such as they will need to go out and give a flood. These are very good projects that you can do. The other thing, one question is, any legal consequence you should be cognizant when providing it during disasters? Yes, there's a lot of legal issues. And I think, how much time I have? Tell me.
You go ahead.
Right. So the legal issues, right? The most important thing that you have to understand is that there is a first responder system. The defense force is not a first responder. The defense force is a military organization that are assigned to a particular task of emergency operations, right? And they actually will follow the instruction of the Minister of National Security and the President of the country, right? Under the Disaster Measures Act, right, the first responders are the police and the fire. In fact, even the ambulance services are not legal, all right, in terms of first responder, but they follow the standing orders of doctors. So they are really first responders in a true sense. When you go into a particular community, you must understand that the legislation says that if a flooding occurs, the fire services is the first responder that actually in charge of that scene. If there's a crime scene, it's the police. Yes. So once you enter a scene that is declared as a disaster, you have to make sure that you communicate with the fire services because they are the first responders. If, for example, you attempt to rescue someone, or let us say that you bring food, just say that you bring food for a family, and for some reason, that family gets an allergy and one of them gets an anaphylactic shock and dies because of the food that you have given them, you have a liability. You see? So one of the things that we do recommend Rotary clubs to do right now, and of course, I'm sure you all know about it, is to form a limited liability company to cover the club members when they act on behalf of the club. This is very important in the context of the law in Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm sure our past AG was Debbie Rupchan had spoken to a number of the clubs with respect to the current laws when it comes to forming a non-governmental organization or a company, right? This is very important for you to understand and something that is very, very important going forward. If, for example, you have a certificate, for example, you are given a certificate as a first aid person, or you have a training certificate from UTT, for example, and you are in a community and you see something happening, then we don't have a good Samaritan law in Trinidad and Tobago. That's another problem, right? We don't have a good Samaritan law. So you could be accused of doing something that is out of your jurisdiction or out of your training. If you try to save a life, nobody would have a problem with that. But if you cause injury while trying to save a life, you can be, under the laws of Trinidad and Tobago, you can be prosecuted and you can be charged. So there are certain things. That's why the tabletop exercises are very important. And that is why Rotary clubs must liaise with the local fire officers or the local police stations, right, to ensure that when they go into a community, there's also the disaster management units that are 2 or 4 people within each of the 14 municipalities in Trinidad, and in Tobago, we have something called TIMA. So therefore, once you are within your community, your disaster committee of your club should have a meeting with the chief fire officer within your area and the police officer, the superintendent or the assistant superintendent, and the disaster management unit. Have that meeting at the beginning of the year or as soon as possible before the hurricane season, and have a meeting with them and be on the same line with them. And therefore, when you're going to give humanitarian aid, the other agency that is very important is the Ministry of Social Services, or whatever you call them at the time, social development or whatever, right? Because they have a system where they have what is called a disaster team there. And they also have something called a needs assessment form. In other words, and there's a particular form that is issued by the government that assesses the need of a particular person who have been impacted by a disaster. So it's always good to kind of work with these agencies so you don't work in a silo. But at the same time, Rotary tries to allow independence, because sometimes when you go into the government system, a lot of the persons, because of political or other reasons, don't get help. So it's a kind of a joint sort of approach that Rotary clubs will have to do, because if you didn't have Rotary clubs, sometimes a lot of people who were supposed to get help from the government, they don't get the help. You see, so it's a mix. All right. Right. So one of the questions is that, can someone sue the state for not providing the necessary things such as clearing of rivers to avoid the flooding? And the answer to that is yes and no, because the problem with that is that in some, for example, in some states, for example, that liability is a municipality, is under the local government laws. They are responsible for the burgesses. The answer to that is we haven't had that type of civil action in this country, but in other countries we have had it. And the problem is that, if we are to look at precedents in law in Trinidad, I was in ODPM for 6 years. Never once have we had such litigation. So the problem is proving directly that the cause of the flooding was due to a lack of drainage, because sometimes it's a combination. And that's why I told you that in South America, they call it socio-natural, meaning that the government has a responsibility, but at the same time, the community has a responsibility. Part of the reason why the drains are blocked is because the people higher up cut branches and they throw galvanize and they put and they block up the drains. So if the government has to clean the mess of the community, if a person is building a house and he drops his gravel right further up and it blocks the drain and the water comes from the drain onto the street, who are you going to sue? Is it the government for not clearing the drains, or is it the person with the gravel? So see, these are the things that when you do a little analysis of it, it's a joint problem, you see? I'm not saying that you can't, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't, but it's something that you have to look at. What is the age you're allowed to help? Because I'm 11. The answer to that is you could help and learn first aid if once you're cognizant of understanding first aid. But in terms of legally assisting someone in humanitarian action, basically you will be an assistant to someone who is an adult over 16 years of old, according to the law of Trinidad and Tobago. So you have to be careful that anything that is construed as helping could be construed as working, and you're not supposed to be working under the age of at least 16 in Trinidad, So those are the kind of things that might preclude you. But of course, if somebody's falling and we teach you to help someone from protecting themselves and moving an adult into an area, for example, if your family falls because they have a stroke, you can protect them, their head from hitting something. So there are certain things you can learn at 11 years old that can save lives. Very important. I hope that helps you. Yeah. You're never too old to help someone. That is very important. Yeah. So now in the context of the government of Trinidad and Tobago, the ODPM has lost a lot of its strength in terms of the last 4 years because of more a philosophy of mode of action. And because of a lack of resources. They don't have the money that I had when I was there. I started to have dwindling resources in my last year, but we had put a lot of things in place that if we're allowed to continue, such as the call center or the 1511 number, we would have had better response to some of our hazards and hazard impacts over the past few years. So that is something that I think we should restart. The second thing that it is that there is something called a National Emergency Operations Center. Let us say that you have an earthquake in the next 5 to 10 minutes, and right away our houses start to shake, and within half an hour we have lost electricity, power is gone, we have no electricity, and that will probably remain there for about 5 to 10 days. All you're hearing is the car alarms going off because everything else is silent, no current, whatever it is. What do you do? What do you do? And therefore, this is something that you have to ask yourself, what do you do? And this is where the government has a responsibility, because unless the internet systems are up and you have Facebook and whatever, because you're going to lose that initially. If the earthquake is so bad that it affects the cables that are coming in to Trinidad and Tobago. Remember when we had the problem with the Kikem Jenny? Remember that one of the cables were very close to that volcano. And that caused a drop in the internet service for almost a day in Trinidad and Tobago. I'm sure you all remember that. So if we have an earthquake that is strong enough in the northeast of our country, where that cable is coming in, I don't know if you all know, but that cable is coming in through Chagaramas. And it's passing to the north of the country, just somewhere, you know, where that where the cement factories or the cement places when you're going across to the peninsula. Yes, that area is where that cable is coming in. So if, for example, anything that affects that cable, you wouldn't have internet as well. So here is where Rotarians have to understand that we are due for a big earthquake. We have always been due for that. We're overdue for that earthquake. We had it a few years, I think it's 2 years ago. We had a little experience with that, but it's going to come. Hopefully not in my lifetime, but it will come. And if it comes, and when it comes, preparations should be like, what do you do? And I think tabletop exercising is very important because the government has to set up the NEOC. Each one of the 14 municipalities have to set up what is called the Emergency Operations Center. And Rotarians must have a place in that operation center. And that is why I'm hoping that if the disaster preparedness units of each of the clubs in each of your areas meet with the disaster management unit, that communication that you can create between you and the disaster management unit of the corporation, it must be sustainable, it must be maintained every single year that the Rotary Club is in existence, especially when you're dealing with disasters, okay? There is a question as, how do we work around COVID restrictions in terms of doing needs assessments and surveying streets and houses in order to create a plan for a particular community, especially in low-income ones, where virtual assessments aren't possible due to the lack of resources? Well, I think, Candy, the thing is, we did it when we had general elections in 2020. People were going down to these streets and people were asking people to come to vote. I was part of that process in I think it was Moruga Tableland. And I saw people actually going into homes with masks and talking to people. I was walking the streets with Mr. Vasan Bharat when I went up for internal elections in the UNC, which I've now resigned from, but it's something that we were doing at the time. If you look at what's happening right now in Trinidad and Tobago, people are going to homes and people are talking and people are communicating. And once you have a social distance, and it's very easy for someone to pass in a vehicle, hail out somebody and talk to them from a distance and ask them some questions. So it's not impossible. It's happening. Once you maintain the 6 feet apart and you have your mask, I don't see that that is being impossible at all. I mean, once you reach in front of a house, you can very well tell whether that house is a flat house, whether they have loose galvanized sheetings, whether you have a drain that is clogged up with rubbish and gunk, right, in the house as well as out of the house. These are assessments that we can make. So when we are writing a letter to the corporation and we are saying, well, look, we have gone into 5 villages that have been affected by floods regularly within the past 5 years. We know that these villages will have flood again. When we calculated the amount of drainage, right, that are existing there, we found that there's 785 meters of drainage. And out of those 785 meters, only 10% of that 785 meters are actually clean and clear. Therefore, we hope as a Rotary Club to work with you to hope that we can find before the rainy season comes in June, that you try to clean at least 80% of that drainage. Yes? Understand? So the government is not doing it. The local government corporation will only do what they can do when they have funding. But what you are saying now is that there are 785 meters of drainage within a particular flooded areas that needs clearing. And when you went, there's only 10% of that is clear. So clearly, if there's flooding, you're going to get flooding there. See? So these are the things, you know, if somebody in this group have done management, they have done a master's in business administration, or they have done business at university, or they're going to do it, you'll understand that use of something called metrics are very important. See? And it allows you to monitor performance so that if the Rotary clubs can measure the amount of drainage within the high-risk communities, And you can understand high risk. If you go to a village and you say, how many times have you had flooding within the last 5 years? And if they tell you more than 3 times, that's a high risk area. Yes. And if you can calculate the drainage in that, that is something that we can do. We can do that with just, you know, there are things on the phone or apps that when you drive, you can actually calculate the amount of distance that you're driving. You see? So when you're driving on that street and you see that there are clogged drains, you can calculate the amount of drainage that needs to be cleared. And you can do that in January, February, March, so that when April, May, you send letters and letters and you write and you have a meeting so that hopefully by June, they could try clearing some of that. If they can't clear it, then fundraising, then you can go to JICA. The Japanese have an organization. You have the European Union. You could talk to ODPM and you could try to get these drainage clean. You see, I mean, there are certain things that we can do. Okay. Any other questions? Right. So training is something that we want to hope that each club, if they can send 2 names, right? If you have the Rotaract clubs here, the Interact clubs, as well as the Rotary Club, if they can send 2 names, but what we can do is that we can organize with some of the other clubs that are sending me their names as the disaster chair for preparedness. And I had this training session last year in my place. We can do it virtual now. And hopefully by the beginning of next year, in January, February, we can actually do it physically at my place for free. We can get the people to come. We can do it virtually, and we can run the little tabletop exercises. We can teach the clubs to create their own emergency operations plans, as I indicated to you, and the components of those plans that are very important. All right. So, Rotarian Dana, I think I'm finished. Yes.
Thank you very much. And your 45 minutes went way. You anticipated that your 45 minutes would be too long. You went very good, very good presentation.
Oh my God, I apologize. Sorry.
No. Very good. I think it was because of the mere fact that we had the Interact members and the Rotaract members. I think that's where the stirring of the interest has lied, because you channel you talk to them so that they can be part of the process moving forward. So I want to call on Dr. Massieu to move a vote of thanks and to let you know that Rotary Club of Penal will present you a token of appreciation, but we will do it at your place. We can't do it virtual, so we'll drop it for you at your place. But I'll ask Dr. Massieu to move the vote of thanks.
Okay, thanks.
President, fellow Rotarians, are you all hearing me?
Yes, we are.
Right, thanks. Okay, so on behalf of the president and members of the Rotary Club of Penal, I want to first of all thank our Rotarian in charge of training for this year, Rotarian Deonarine, for continuing to do an excellent job in organizing these very, very informative sessions that we all benefit from. Also want to thank the teachers who are responsible for coordinating the Interact clubs in the different schools. I want to thank all the interactors for coming out tonight and participating in our session. We also want to thank the Rotaractors who made the time to attend and for asking these questions. And I would like to, of course, to thank all the Rotarians who took the time out to attend tonight for make this a very wonderful session, a very informative session. And most importantly, my good friend, Dr. Stephen Ramroop, who is one of the living experts on disaster preparedness in the region, as we all know. And again, Stephen, true to form, he has again used his particular skill in delivery and ensuring that the entire, 45 minutes, the time flew, and we were all enthralled and interested, and we were motivated by what he had to say, and for his, his style and his simplicity, yet, giving us some good direction and good pointers in terms of preparing ourselves, our clubs, to deal with the, with disasters as and when they arise. And I also want to assure Dr. Ramroop that our club, as well as the clubs that we sponsor, will of course send those 2 names of persons who will, who will be trained and who will continue to be trained in January when we have the live sessions and so on. And On behalf of the members of the Rotary Club of Penal and all who attended tonight, Dr. Ramroop, we want to thank you so much for giving off your time. And of course, we want you to continue to give off your time and talent to the, the people in this part of the country. And we wish you all the best for the future. And we look forward to continuing to learn and to improve as we deal with our community issues, and of course environmental, as you pointed out, the new avenue of service in Rotary is this thing with environmental protection. And of course we will continue to rely on your guidance as a club as we prepare ourselves to deal with all the future challenges. Thank you all very much and have a good evening.
Thank you all. Have a good night. Thank you, Dr. Ramroop.